Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to welcome you all today. Just to let you know, this seminar is being recorded for our archive use. So my name is Jina. I'm one of the directors of Livingmaps Network. And today, on the behalf of the Livingmaps Network, I welcome our speaker, Alexander Mourant, who will be sharing his project called A Place to Call Home. Alexander is an artist, writer and educator based in London. He achieved BA Photography at Falmouth University and MA Photography at Royal College of Art, London. And his work has been included in professional publications such as British Journal of Photography, and he is continuously showing his practice at many well-known places such as the Saatchi Gallery and Peckham 24 and etc. I'll briefly introduce the project A Place to Call Home. It is a school collaboration project led by Alexander Mourant, working with Wandsworth Council's Children's Services and Arts Service and pupils from 51 local schools. The project was designed to encourage children to reconnect with their sense of being part of their local community in response to the distance and isolation felt during the pandemic, COVID. Even though a few months have passed since the show is down, I had very lovely responses from the local schools and the Wandsworth Council recalling this work as a memorable and significant project. I also heard that the Wandsworth local MP, Fleur Anderson, shared some of the work with the Countess of Wessex during the Jubilee celebrations. Lovely to hear that it has a lasting effect, a lasting legacy. Today, Alexander will give us a talk all about his fascinating project. And he also mentioned he prepared a little exercise for us afterwards. So if you can have something to draw with, such as pens, pencils, pastels, anything to draw with, and a piece of paper, it'll be great. And let me introduce Joel Thief. He's one of our Livingmaps advisory group. He will join us at the discussion, the Q&A time. And thank you very much for your time, Joel. So I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Brill, thanks very much for the introduction. Can I just double check you can see everything okay? All nice and clear?
Can everyone see the slides?
Brilliant.
Perfect.
Also, I hadn't heard about that Countess of Wessex thing. That's good that the project's continuing. So yeah, I'm Alexander. I'm an artist, as my bio says, based in London. I wanted to tell you a bit about my personal practice before speaking about A Place to Call Home, to give you a better idea of where I come from and how I'm grounded. As Gina mentioned, I studied at Falmouth University and then the Royal College of Art. So living down in Cornwall with the natural environment was lovely for a couple of years, and then moving to a more urban setting in the centre of London. Alongside my personal practice, I'm also a member of Revolve Collective. We're a group of 7 artists that work within the expanded field of photography. So artists who work with sort of sculpture, collage, performance and video, sort of pushing the medium. What binds us is our encouragement and support of arts and opportunities. So we work to create opportunities for young early career artists to sort of inspire growth within their practice. And we look to bridge the gap between early career and mid-career artists. We also actually have an open call on at the moment called the Revolve Awards, which is a mentorship program in case you happen to know any young photographers or artists that would like to get involved. So all of this is to say that I have sort of collaboration and collective spirit at the heart of my practice alongside the more independent work. So on my BA for my dissertation, explored land art, photography and time. There are 3 themes that really have forever fascinated me. For those who might not be familiar, land art was a movement that kind of reached its peak in the 60s and 70s. all over the world actually, but primarily in Europe and America. Those are the most well documented. But really land art has been happening for thousands of years. Stonehenge is a land artwork. So they're artists that defied the traditional gallery system of the white cube space and sort of sought a different existence and nature of making work outside in the landscape. They're artists that use sort of elemental practices, so earth, air, wind, fire, to sort of expand and push what art could be, or what art could be known as. So for me, their work has always been really interesting because it helps push mediums and question what sculpture could be. And so often in my work, I draw upon the sort of spatial sensitivities they have, and also use methodologies to help push photography too. So the land art is an ongoing thread within all of my practice. So I wanted to take you through a small little project I made to give you a sense of how projects begin, build, and then finish. And the work I've chosen is To Feel Its Touch. This is a piece originally commissioned by the Financial Times for their My London commission. And this is a commission that happens yearly for 4 artists. And so 4 artists are invited to respond to the experience of being an artist in London. What does it mean to be an artist in the city? How is your work influenced by the city? Is it even? So that was the sort of a very open brief that I was excited to receive. It took me quite a while to work out what I would do. So mainly it was a couple of weeks of just being receptive and walking around the city. So one morning I was walking from High Street Kensington tube station to Hyde Park. Hyde Park is where one of the RCA campuses is. And as I was walking, on my right hand side, I came across this amazing excavation of the road. It was about 4 meters wide, 9 meters long, and 5 meters deep. And it was an excavation that immediately reminded me of Michael Heiser's Double Negative, the colossal earthwork made in the Nevada desert in 1969. This is a work which explores absence and presence within the landscape, but it's also an artwork that questions or represents deep time, the idea of strata and geologies and layering. So as soon as I'd seen the road excavation, I thought of Heiser, and then I began to think about the materials that had been taken away from that space, removed from the site. And I've got a sort of funny relationship with materials and with sort of inanimate objects generally. I always think about how perhaps those objects and on that infrastructure actually remembers my passing as much as I remember it. So I often try and like boil down things to numbers. So how many times have I walked across a pavement? How many times have I visited a particular train station? Is it just me that remembers that culmination and building of place, or is it the actual place and environment too? So I began to think about how maybe the materials below the surface that had been excavated maybe actually had absorbed my passing previously, and as this weird kind of activated memory. That was the kind of initial idea. And then I was also thinking about the Boyle family. They make these amazing casts of different landscapes and environments, such as urban city centres and sort of out in the countryside. I was interested in them about the surface, but also how they're representing a 3-dimensional, a 3D environment, but through a surface. So it's kind of 2.5D. And when you bring it back to the fact that I'm a photographer, I'm primarily based in making images, I was trying to grapple with how I represent this depth, this depth of the material, this space that had been excavated, but within a 2-dimensional medium that is photography. So that was really the challenge. So here's the work I eventually made for the commission. Here it is published in the FT. What I decided to do was to work with the idea of excavated materials, but center myself on places of extreme personal significance. And so for me, London my mental mind map of London began when I used to visit my uncle who used to live here. So going to stay at his flat for the weekend when I was 16, or even younger with my parents when I was like 9 or 10 years old. So I centered myself or my search from his flat, and every week I was checking TfL's website to see if there's any road excavations happening nearby. And then luckily one day there was an excavation on his road. And so I went to the road and spoke to some of the construction workers and managed to harvest some of the material that they dug out from underneath the road and take it with me back to the darkroom. So what I did is I took this like sort of charged material into the darkroom, and then I constructed or placed a large fish tank and then filled it with water. And then I'd made a special wooden frame that would take 9 large format negatives. And so these negatives, these analog negatives, would be slipped underneath the fish tank. And then during a performative gesturing of the material into the water, I would record the textures it would create. So in order to make an exposure, I would stand on one side and performatively throw this material I'd harvested into the tank. The material would slowly sort of fluctuate and dissipate, creating these amazing abstract forms. For me, looking at them now, it's interesting how the forms sort of interconnect over negative space, and how also it's sort of creating a pseudo record of a time and place, but also of the artist reflecting on the nature of place. At the same time, I was also commissioned to show at Peckham 24 in a group show called For Those Who Could See Beyond the Surface, which in hindsight is actually an amazing title for the piece I produced. And so because it's based in Peckham, I thought about creating a site-specific work with material harvested from Peckham Rye Lane, putting this material through the same process I developed for the FT. For those of you that have been to Peckham recently or know of Peckham, you'll know it's a site of much discussion. There's a lot of regeneration going on, also gentrification, things that are sort of polarizing communities, and it's quite a hot topic really. For me, it speaks about how the city is an organism generally and constantly deconstructs and forms again. Thinking about ideas of entropy and things being continually reformed and taking new shape. So I'd taken materials and then made an abstract photogram work to then represent in Peckham for the show. When you look at the piece, you can see how, as I mentioned, textures and fabrics interconnect across the negative space, which also nods back to Michael Heiser's double negative, this kind of absence, this cut into a time stream or landscape. Okay, so the reason why you're all here is actually a place to call home. So alongside my personal practice, as I've mentioned, I'm also an educator. I'm really, really interested in how people learn and how I learn as well. And so a place to call home came out of a previous series of workshops that I'd run with Wandsworth Council and the Royal College of Art. In May 2021, I ran a series of workshops with 3 other artists called A Greener Picture. And this was a series of workshops on climate change, but through the lens of photography. So working with 14 local schools, primary schools, to create photography workshops and sculptures that questioned climate change and the environment. That was a really exciting series of workshops, and the council then invited me to pitch another idea for this much bigger commission, which would see the council partner with both private and state schools to sort of build bridges between them and encourage more cross-pollination and conversations. And so I began to think about what I could do. The key objectives were these: to foster new links and relationships between Wandsworth's independent and state schools, to engage young people from Wandsworth schools in art projects to produce a collaborative artwork, to bring all these artworks together to create a collective piece to be exhibited publicly, Importantly, to ensure an equal playing field too, for all the schools taking part, regardless of the school's status or demographic. And lastly, I would have to provide all the schools with a toolkit that includes creative exercises and examples. So a big, ambitious project. So it did require some deep thinking about what subject could actually encompass all of this and how might we all begin to work together. So I began to think about the subject of community itself. The project was based around cultivating the community, but I thought about actually making the subject of the artwork community itself, and how through various approaches to this subject we could actually embody and practice communities together. So it's kind of like a meta narrative within the project. The original brief used this metaphor, different boats in the same storm, to discuss COVID. And really for them, this was about responding and creating a cathartic project from the experience of COVID, where everyone had been in lockdown, stuck in their homes, and how this project was to inspire us to reconnect with our sense of belonging and being a part of a community. I took the idea and began to think about the idea of homes and architecture of homes, and how really a community is really just many homes within a home. So really we all live under the same roof. Beginning to think about how the home is not just four walls that surround us, but the spaces and people that surround us. So my home is also where I walk my dog in the park, or where I get my hair cut, or where I go to the supermarket. A home is an expanded field too, and that for me is a community. And so that was the idea, the approach, and I began to think about how we could represent the home. To be, quite clear, quite easily graspable by the kids, I thought about creating a structure, a house. The pitch was a cartoon house that you can see here on the right-hand side. And the idea was to create a two-dimensional woodcut house that would be installed on the gallery wall, which was actually broken up into many different pieces, almost like a puzzle. So in this example, I think there are 32 pieces. And so those wooden panels would go to either 32 different schools or 32 classes. And then the class would create an artwork on their panel, which would then get reassembled back in the exhibition and create this amazing tapestry of different voices, ideas, techniques, all encompassing and representing the same structure, a place where we can all live and dwell. On the left-hand side, you can see a kind of a mood board image of sort of colorful shapes. For me, I wanted it to be really visually engaging and also like quite tactile, feel like you can really enter the environment and the landscape we were building in the exhibition. I was really excited to have the pitch accepted, and it triggered a very long process. I think the project was in the end 7 to 8 months long, and we had to overcome various COVID challenges, delays. There was a lot of admin to do in a project such as this. It was great because I began to start working with the steering committee made up of various heads of school to sort of meet everyone's requirements and make sure we had an inclusive environment. And one of them was to develop the idea of the architecture further. Of course, we don't live in cartoon houses, we live in the real world. So I began working with an illustrator to create types of architectures that represent real lives and real places within Wandsworth. So working from photography I'd made of the area to represent different types of dwellings, so terrace streets, social housing, detached houses, bungalows, flats. And so it was really important to represent those types of architectures, mainly so anyone who came to the exhibition, and especially the kids, could identify with a type of architecture as being theirs. But it's also important to say that the architectures weren't specifically linked to a type of school. Everyone was blended and intermingled. It was about creating the whole encompassing idea of a community. This is an example of how one of the architectures went from a drawing into a visual, into a render. And so you can see here that little orange rectangle represents one panel, which hasn't been coated in white paint yet. It's just a raw panel. So every class would get a unique panel, which they could then use a map to see where their panel would go in the exhibition. Here is a larger render or SketchUp model of the final design with the different buildings working together. And bottom left, you can see a kind of bird's eye view of how the structures would begin to interact with each other. To design this, I also had to collaborate with Jack and Sam Caravosso, who are amazing artists, but also sort of engineers and designers. And they were the lead in helping me design and manufacture these structures. So as I mentioned, the project also required designing quite an extensive series of creative exercises. This was so every school felt supported. Some schools are less comfortable with the way they teach art, and so it was up to me and everyone I was collaborating with to create a series of accessible exercises that a school or a class could pick and choose, they could pick and choose from. So I think I gave a 10,000 word PDF that had various sessions outlined with instructions and different ways of working, with lots of prompts and hints as well to help everyone on their way. So the creative exercises for me really draw upon the work of Dora Mourant. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dora Mourant, but she's a Hungarian conceptual artist who really began trailblazing education within the art field in the 60s and 70s. So in the 70s, she worked with Miklos Erdely, another Hungarian artist, I believe, to create a series of creative exercises, an ongoing series of workshops over 2 years. These workshops were designed for actually the children of factory workers, but proved to be so popular that students came from all over to visit the site and to participate in the workshop series. I think it ran for 2 years and eventually was shut down, but what remains is documentation and fragments of instructions for each exercise. What drew me to this was the fact that it centers itself on collaborative working and thinking about how individuals can influence an environment and how an environment can influence you. Collectively, Dora Mourant kind of deconstructed the idea of the artist as this singular, mythical, creative genius, and actually proposed that in fact any artist work or any sort of art dialogue comes from conversation. It comes from participation and collaboration. And thinking about creativity further, I realized that creativity is an essential vehicle to expanding what we know, but also how we empathize and understand others. I believe a truly creative individual or creative society is so much more inclusive because it allows you to have an open mind. That's probably quite a simple thing to think about, but I think for children, for encouraging their creativity and the agency it will give them, I think is completely invaluable. And so the creative exercises I provided were broken down into 5 main sessions. Session 1 was making connections, which is exactly that. How do we begin? So introducing the topic of community to the kids and beginning to question who they are, their personal identities, and how that may form and influence and contribute to a community. Session 2 was drawing with friends, which is probably my favorite session, which mainly centers itself on experimental drawing exercises and performance. This kind of sort of pushed everyone outside of their comfort zones and also really allowed play to come into it. like the idea of play and experimentation to come back into learning. Session 3 was the space of architecture, which looked at literally architecture, thinking about the infrastructure of Wandsworth, and various buildings and how in fact buildings can influence you. There are some assignments as well, which were for out of school working. These were mainly photography exercises, where if a class wanted to generate more material for their panel, they could ask the kids to, for example, on the weekend, go to their favorite place to photograph it or to take pictures of their family. Again, it was about building a bigger picture of Wandsworth outside of just the school. Session 4 was panel production, where having completed all of those sessions or dipped in and out, a school could take one particular way of working they'd learned, for example, frottage, like sort of rubbings that they've been doing, and amalgamate that or make a collage on the panel. I'd given 9 examples of how they could use different mediums and techniques to create their panel, but also we really encourage them to take ownership of it and to bring their own ideas and processes to the panel too. And lastly, session 5, which I think a lot of kids really enjoyed, was feeling into words. And this was a summative exercise which took the form of imagining writing a message. So each pupil would write a message, and this message would go into a bottle, and the bottle would sort of float down the Wandle, which is a river in Wandsworth, and be picked up by another member of the community who they didn't know. And so this message was one, it could be one of hope, could be one of opportunity, could be one of the future, or it could also be one of what they hope to see would change about the community, things like that. So feeling into words was a way of each pupil having their voice heard by someone anonymous. And I like that idea, and it's something that everyone really what's the word I'm looking for, participated in. So of course, Livingmaps Network centers itself on mapping. So it would be, I'd be remiss to not speak exactly about mapping. So I've taken a couple exercises from the main sessions that specifically deal with mapping. This could be a literal mapping of sort of using maps, or an expanded mapping in terms of like the body and senses. So the first one is what is a community, which asks the class to position community as the central word, and then to build a word cloud or a spider diagram around the word. It was designed so they would go in turns. So I would put the word community up, and then I would maybe say park, and then someone after me would say tree, or whatever they felt related to that word. It's a way of creating an interconnected web, and to relate images and spaces and places to the word of community. The next one was merging the bodies of the class, which was from our sort of expanded drawing session, where each school was given a large piece of paper to stick onto the floor. And then every pupil was encouraged to lie down and take a position with their body. And then another member of the class would have to draw around the outline of their body. And so every member of the class took turns until they'd drawn someone else and been drawn. And then eventually they'd all stand back and see this amazing sort of intermingled shape of all of their bodies. So again, it was kind of a metaphor about how different identities and bodies exist within a space, which is a community. Tracing surfaces, which was frottage. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with frottage, the process of frottage. For those that aren't, it's when you take a piece of paper or a piece of card and use charcoal or pastels to just rub on various surfaces to create a record of the texture. Something that Max Ernst, the surrealist, really used a lot in his practice. So the pupils were encouraged to make frottages of the classroom, but also of the playground, to really look deeper and question surfaces, to think about how, you know, we all live within this space, we all occupy it, What is the nature of this surface and this environment? One of my favorites is listening to the community, which is what we will be doing later. So this was a sound drawing exercise where pupils had to draw what sounds look like without drawing the sound, without drawing what things visually look like. This is quite a challenging exercise, mainly for adults actually, because adults are we often think we know everything. We're often adamant that everything is exactly how we imagine it being. And this is an exercise to sort of unlearn and to question and see what things could actually be. From home to school is perhaps a literal mapping exercise where pupils were encouraged to travel through memory. So take a piece of paper and write the word home in the center or in the corner and draw your home. And then using your memory the best you could, imagine your entire route to school. So that could be on the bus, or it could be on the train, or it could be walking, or it could be in the car. It's interesting how when you take a journey so often, you often turn off and you lose your powers of observation. So this is about you sort of pushing the pupils to really think hard about the environment they travel through, and also to sort of make records of those places that might be the most important to them. So this exercise is deeply connected to the imagined high street, which follows on from the mapping exercise to think about each pupil selecting one building or structure from their journey, or in fact they could invent an entirely imagined one to build as a sculpture. So each pupil in the class chose a structure that interests them, and then out of recyclable materials such as cardboard boxes, shoe boxes, Pringle tubes, they would construct their building. So in the example here, we have Al Forno, which is an Italian restaurant in Wandsworth. And I love the little tables and chairs in front as well. That's very cute. The idea was that the pupils could shape this high street, which for them embodied all the most important places within their collective experience of the community. It also questions how during COVID, high streets really suffered, and how the high street is often the social hub and the center point of a community. It's where stories are shared, and it's important that we all remember how vital that is to encouraging growth and sustained community spirit. So here are some pictures of the final exhibition after all that work. The schools had the creative materials and the panels for about 2 months or 3 months. And then one by one, they returned, and it was really fantastic to unwrap them and begin seeing the final results. The exhibition, the venue was Southside Shopping Centre. For those of you that haven't been, it's a really important shopping centre in Wandsworth where a lot of the community gathers. And we were really pleased to have this art exhibition within such a place that is not intimidating. Often exhibitions and galleries, highbrow galleries, are very intimidating, and maybe some families would be discouraged to visit if that was the case. But this was incredible. Even when I was installing, kids were like pulling their parents towards the space and were so fascinated by it. They immediately identified it as a space for them, which I loved, and it really encouraged a lot of visitors. I think in the end we had 4,000 to 5,000 visitors over 3 weeks, which we're really pleased with. And in the end, about 900 pupils came back to visit the exhibition, to see their artworks on display and to do a workshop. So it really was a full circle experience for them. Here are some of the installations. So you can begin to see the variety of panels, how different classes use the different techniques, and how when it came together, it's like this amazing tapestry. which again speaks of diversity. I think I'd point out this is some of the amazing works created from the Space of Architecture session. On the tables, you can see all the different types of buildings that were created. And then on the top is an amazing 5-meter drawing of From Home to School, where an entire class had made a collaborative drawing along one imagined road where they placed all their favorite places. And that was incredible to see. I was really glad we could have that installed in the exhibition. At the end, we had sort of more behind the scenes images and documentation. I mean, throughout the exhibition, it broke down what happened within the creative exercises on info boards. But at the end, we also had a short documentary that had interviews with pupils and teachers who'd taken part, how they felt the experience had gone for them and what their favorite bits were. And perhaps what any lasting impacts of the exhibition would be. We also had some interactive sections of the exhibition because we really wanted it to be active for visitors, mainly adults that were coming or kids that hadn't had the opportunity to participate, to be included. And these interactive boards were exercises that came from the original resource. So this was Messages for the Community, which was the Feeling into Words exercise. And over the period of the exhibition, it really became an amazing cacophony of voices. And what you have is these different opinions and visions and hopes overlapping each other and becoming this like fabric of voices, which was really lovely. You could spend a lot of time with the comments and reflect on what you felt actually the community means for you and to you. And then lastly, we also had a personal portraits board where we had a table and colourful pencils set up, so anyone who visited could do a personal portrait of themselves, and to fill that with their interests, hobbies, anything that they felt defined them, and then add it to the community board. And I was mentioning the top right one is actually my gran. My gran visited the exhibition and did her own drawing, which is nice to have. I should say that the exhibition isn't really an end point. We all viewed it as a beginning, as a launch pad. It's about stimulating the idea of community, having that lacking throughout most of our lives the past 2 years. And it's going to be the beginning of an ongoing series of collaborations between these schools. So I'm very excited to see what comes next. Perhaps that'd be a good point for maybe any questions or thoughts anyone's had so far.
Wow, thank you so much, Alex. Joelle, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe we can open the discussion?
I've got a whole list of notes I've made here, so I hope I don't catch you on the hop, Alexander.
That's all right.
Should we put some slides on?
Do you want me to put slides on? Sorry.
Yes, please. Is there any specific slide that you want to talk about, Joelle?
You okay if I ask a question, Gina?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to pick a question that I've got some ones that I personally I'm very interested in terms of the fact that I'm a play worker. Because you did mention wordplay a couple of times. Immediately, I want to know more. But that's not about me. I'm just trying to think, and there's a couple that a couple of things you talked about right at the start of your presentation I'd like to know about more, but that's maybe a little bit more of a challenging question. Maybe what strikes me most, I think, is that image there, actually, coincidentally. I was thinking about this image. Is it from home to school, did you say?
Yeah, so the top is from the home to school exercise, and then the bottom is the Imagine High Street.
Right.
And
so
yeah, it's just a couple examples.
I suppose my question is, what sort of things are the children interested in? in, generally speaking, on that route? I know it's not a real route from what you were saying. What sort of things generally stuck out for you? What they were including in their art?
What yeah, that's a good question. What was, so for example, in the sculptures at the bottom on the tables, we had restaurants, clothes shops. We also had like tube stations and bus stops, and very practical things, as well as very personal things, like clothes shops, fashion shops, people that are interested in fashion. And then some people actually depicted their school as well, as their favorite place, because that's where their friends culminate. So I guess it was a complete variety of places. I wasn't expecting only like arcades or things like that, or cinemas. It was a quite variety of some of the most ordinary places that you wouldn't think had any particular significance or meaning, but in fact they did, which was nice to have.
I like what you said, the ordinary places, because I think we as adults tend to like overlook, even when we're physically in a street, we tend to overlook places that children see fascinations in. So I don't really particularly want to steer my questions all the way down the idea of play, but if you'll forgive me a minute, because it really does interest me quite a lot, what you talked about there. You talked a bit earlier on about experimental drawing exercises and, quote, allowing play to come back into it. Really interested in what you meant by that, and what experimental drawing exercises, other than what you've already talked about, came into the whole process.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's something I've been like trying to make more and more as I like design future workshops, trying to push that sort of expanded sense of playfulness and experimentation, and how we can learn through exercises that aren't particularly obvious in terms of learning, if that makes sense, rather than 1 + 1 must equal 2, so we had, for the drawing, we had actually first a mirroring exercise. I mean, in a way you could say the body is a drawing, and so everyone in the class would stand up and have to mirror any movements that occurred on the person on the left or the right hand side of them. So if I was standing next to you and you gently moved your shoulder by accident, I would have to mimic that, and that in turn would set off a chain reaction of shoulder nudges throughout the class, but they could only mimic who was next to them. So you could be directly the other side and see loads of hand movements, but can't move yourself if it hadn't like rippled its way around to you. So that was the beginning of like drawing with friends. It started actually with a bit of a game, and then we had the drawing the outline of the bodies and of shapes of body parts, things like that. We had the frottage, and then at the end we also had the drawing of faces and the cutting and collaging of identities. Yeah, so it was those 4.
I love doing experimental drawing. I mean, I'm doing my PhD on drawing, so I believe in the power
yeah,
of
nice.
drawing, yes. So when I ask the students or the people to draw, they really go, oh, how should I hold my pencil? Do I hold it like this? Do I hold it like that?
Yeah.
How should I draw? But if you do some experimental drawing, such as something like draw while you're not looking at the paper, you can look at the object, or I don't know, draw with the other hand that you normally don't use, or something like that, and it creates some, I don't know, creativity, I'll say, in a way, and it really releases people and trying to respond to the real problem that we have to face on. So I think it was brilliant that you did it with the children too.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So I was going to say, to follow up on all of that, and also picking up on something I've just seen a question come up on the screen, similar to what I was going to ask, is the kind of the reaction of the teaching staff, or how, given that it might not necessarily have been their usual way of teaching art, for example, how did they participate themselves? Or?
Oh, that's a really great question. So a part of this project was me being able to lead CPD sessions. So I ran workshops. I did a talk about basically a very similar talk I've just given you about who I am and what I think the vision of the project is and how it's going to end up looking. And then I did some of the exercises with the teachers. I think it was really important, especially because of some of the expanded activities, which are maybe a bit hard to grasp if you were just reading about them. It was a great way of getting a lot of the teachers involved and to get them to meet each other as well, because it was many different schools in one space. And so we did those sessions and got really familiarized and quite energized by what the project would be. There was 3 sessions with about 30 or 40 teachers in each session. So for them, it was kind of like, I gave them their booklet, we had a chat, anyone had any concerns, we could resolve them. And also it was a way of partnering schools together. So some art teachers had more time or more resources, so they actually went and visited another school that needed extra help or support.
That's
Which is brilliant, because one of the main outcomes of this project was to create that kind of dialogue and ongoing relationships.
connection with the other schools as well.
Yeah.
Right. So you gave the workshop to the teachers first, and then the teachers went to their children, is it?
Yeah, so actually I never gave any of the workshops. I gave the workshops to the teachers, and the teachers then used those materials the way they wanted and made it work for them, and then delivered the sessions.
Okay.
But then I got to run workshops with the kids in the finished exhibition to reflect on what they'd done.
Right. Okay. Did you see any, I don't want to say this word, but hierarchies between the schools? Because you said there was a mixture of schools.
So I guess the clear one that everyone would expect is that a private school that has more resources would do a better piece than a state school, for example. And I'm proud to say there was absolutely none of that happening. It felt everyone did an incredible contribution, and I didn't see any sort of threads or stories repeating itself within it in terms of where a school was or where they're from. Yeah.
And I'm just looking through the chat comments, and some of these questions that listeners are talking about kind of tally with some of my questions. I think I'm going to read this one off, actually, because I was interested in this as well. That's come up next. It's how much do children talk about or represent experiences of COVID and lockdown, the pandemic, and what's your evaluation of community based on that?
I think it definitely came up a lot. It came up a lot in the panels. I should have included a close-up crop of one of the panels. I'm sorry I didn't do that. There was a panel that actually represented community through the idea of a virus. So I think it's, say, for example, bottom right there, you can see there with the green and the red dots, the circles, the very bottom right panel. Yes. There was a series of panels from a school that represented the virus of community for good. So obviously drawing upon COVID as a virus and the visual representations they'd seen of viruses, say, for example, on the news, you see graphics of what a virus looks like. So they used that iconography, but made a virus as a force for good. So the community virus. So something that like projected hope, and that was infectious. So that was an interesting way of seeing how COVID was represented. But also in a lot of the messages for the community at the end, it was a lot about reconnecting and processing that experience of COVID. So it did appear quite a lot.
It was an interesting twist, yeah. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about my own project on COVID, but and children's opinions, which of course I'm not going to go into because this is your presentation of mine.
No, it's all right.
I'm just thinking about how at what point during the lockdown process, because we've had a number going on in this country in different areas in the country, Britain rather. I can't remember the dates of your project, but did you work throughout the whole of COVID? And if so, were there different opinions as the pandemic drifted on in children's thinking processes?
So project began in early summer 2021. So COVID wasn't too much of an
Last
issue
year.
last year.
So it's kind of the tail end of the first hit, really.
Yeah, it was the tail end, but then we had the Christmas period because the exhibition got delayed 3 or 4 times because of COVID, because also schools had to deal with the disruption, and they really couldn't deal with this sort of extra art project when they were trying to like still deliver their core curriculum. And also from our point of view, we wanted to make sure everyone could visit and communities could visit, the families of the kids. And so it made no sense to do the show when, you know, it couldn't have maximum impact and visibility and attendance. In terms of the sort of ongoing durational reflection on COVID, that's not something that I was able to pick up on.
I love the way that you didn't exhibit in a white cube, the gallery, but within the community where the most people go, in a shopping center. And I think that was the biggest part of this project. And even though it was 3 or 4 times delayed, because so many people put on their exhibition to, they changed it to online exhibition, a lot of them, because of COVID. But I'm glad that you put it on site, because it was literally meeting with the community, and it was processing with the messages and drawings with the children. And I think that was the biggest part of this project. I mean, even with my girl, because it's on the way to Waitress, right?
Yeah.
Can we go to that place? What place? The drawing place. What do you mean there's
Amazing.
a drawing place? So I think it was really interactive, and
nice.
Such a good idea that you put the show on and it was within the community.
Yeah, I think that's fortuitous that it ended up there.
It just occurred to me that when Jina uses the phrase "the drawing place," the drawing place has now become part of the map, the physical landscape. It's become kind of like a meta map in itself. That's it. I find it interesting the way children, like Jina just said, kind of name things in their own terms. They've called the exhibition, or he's called the exhibition, the drawing place, which is fascinating to me.
Oh, I love that so much. That's such a nice idea. That perhaps she'll remember that that's the drawing place for a long time in her own mind. You know, if she's navigating that shopping centre on her own in like a couple of years, she'll be like, oh yeah, that's the drawing place.
I do wonder how that translates into children's other, like you imagine High Street, how that translates into naming of other places as well. Like to us, it might be, I don't know, the Greek restaurant or something out of my head. But for a child, it might be the blue place. I don't know.
Yeah.
Making it up as I go along. You know what I mean?
Well, even as an adult, I don't really pay much attention to street names, but I pay a lot of attention to, you know, what objects are there.
I think
I'd be like, oh,
you're an artist, Alex.
yeah. I mean, I was just, factual information is irrelevant. No.
Most of the rest of us navigate by pubs or something like that. But you artists, you navigate by other means.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, please do.
There's one still outstanding on the chat. I'll maybe come back to that in a minute. But I've got a question on, you said about mapping metaphors with emerging bodies, which I understand. I'm just wondering if it's not a little off-piste, what other examples of mapping metaphors you've used within this project or others? Because I think it's a really interesting concept. Might put you on the spot a little bit there with that one.
I think it's like how we have, you know, as I said, there's that meta narrative that the subject is community, but it's community that actually builds the exhibition. It's a community practice in order to speak of community, which is then shown in the community. So it's the various layering. So in terms of mapping, I always, my definition of mapping would be like pinning down to a point or realizing or crystallizing what something is. I feel like that's what my definition of mapping would be, away from just obvious geographical maps. For example, I map feelings within my body. Have you ever been asked, like, what age does that feel? Things like that. So I guess I couldn't directly answer in where it would appear, but I hope it would appear throughout the sort of process of the project for the kids.
I apologise. That probably caught you on the hop a little bit, that one.
No, it's good.
So,
I like those sort of questions. Meaty. Let's get meta.
there's one more outstanding from the chat. I read it directly from Catherine. She says, "Were any of the children involved in the steering group?"
Ah,
Oh, I think Phil wanted to say something as well.
Have I missed one?
I've got another one. Go on.
Go on. Okay.
sorry. Whose question?
Steering group, was it?
Oh, the kids. Unfortunately, they weren't. But that's a really great idea, and they should have been. I'm working on a project at the moment, a new project with a school up in Cumbria, and the kids are the ones who chose the artist who's going to participate with them to make the work. So the organization facilitated the meetings, but the kids interviewed the artist and decided who they're going to work with. I think that's great, giving them that power and that agency to work out and direct their own creativity. So maybe moving forward, it'd be good to have a kid on every committee.
Yeah, it's kind of in playgrounds where I used to work in, and more advanced school projects. United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child comes into this, because Article 12 does talk about children's right to have a say about what affects them. So it's a very good thing to build into anything, I think, in my opinion.
Really good, yeah.
Phil, do you want to go on?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about this message in a bottle activity you did, which I thought was kind of interesting. As far as I can tell you, that was that part of the exhibition? I mean, the bottles with the messages in them.
So
that's a practical question, and then there's a more theoretical question. The experience of, or my experience of doing research in schools with children who aren't listened to for various reasons, to do with class or race or gender or whatever, is that they often are making messages. They don't know if any of those messages are being picked up. Their experiences on the whole, they're not. Or sometimes the messages are picked up in ways that contradict what it is they're trying to say. They're misread or misinterpreted, or they're simply ignored. And of course, that does bring in the dimension of children who go to private schools, who on the whole are used to being listened to, are used to having their words, their desires, their plans for the future taken seriously. And a lot of children who aren't in that privileged situation. So I just wondered, well, first of all, the practical one, was the message in the bottle actually there in the exhibition? And if you've reflected at all about how that kind of activity might be responded to differently, because kids are coming at it from a very different sort of situations.
Thank you for your questions. The practical one, so this is the end product of a message in a bottle. So there was no actual bottles. That was, I guess, the story and the metaphor, which helped the kids imagine where their message would go and how it would be anonymous, and how it's a safe way of delivering messages. For me, that's important, because that also sort of like deconstructs that bias between who gets heard and who doesn't, if it's, you know, an anonymous message floating in the river. I really interesting to hear about what you say about perhaps how some kids from private schools and those types of backgrounds could be used to being heard and being taken seriously, to use inverted commas. I believe the activity was structured in a way so perhaps it did actually empower those that are less inclined to be heard, and it also reduced the power of those that are always heard. It's, you know, it's that level playing field thing again, because when it's a fragment of piece of paper that is the exact same size, you have the exact same space to speak, and really what you do with that space is up to you. And again, there's nothing that directs people in particular to go to a particular message, if that makes sense. You know, the way you move through and around is a kind of like random generator. So again, hopefully that makes it more democratic too. But a really interesting question. I haven't quite processed that. Did that answer you? Not really, but anyway.
Well, I think continuing conversation is something that Livingmaps, certainly our Young Citizens Atlas, we're very concerned about. You know, so yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to address, both conceptually and also in terms of artistic practice and critical pedagogy. I'm very interested in this Dora Mourant. I hadn't come across her work at all, and
she's amazing.
She might have quite a lot to say about this.
So I went to a talk. I believe she's still alive. I went to her talk at Tate Modern. She had an exhibition at Tate Modern a couple of years ago, and I was privileged enough to be in the audience when she was speaking. She wasn't speaking about this period of her life in particular. She's talking about her general practice. But yeah, it was fantastic. I would recommend getting this book, bottom left.
Thank you.
Another question, if I may?
Oh yes, go for it.
Yeah. So, this link, this might put you on the spot a little bit as well. So setting you up just to have a think. Not setting you up, but giving you time to think. I'm, as you know, very much interested in children's play. And you said in your introduction before the main project, a phrase that I've written down about the site remembers my passing, which I find fascinating, but I don't know why. But my notes here say play, and my question in a rough form is how do you or could you surmise a link to play in what you've just said there? Because I can just about do that in my head, and I just wonder. I appreciate that's not your experience during play. But as an adult, we are around children all the time in the city because they are part of the community, even if we don't know it. So I wondered if there's anything in your conscious or subconscious thinking about how the site remembers children's passing.
So interesting. So the site and the passing was from that personal project, which is a way of thinking that comes from Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca Solnit is a key anchor point, again, for my practice. And she has a famous book, Field Guide to Getting Lost, and The Faraway Nearby, where she speaks about how in the end, it's not places that you possess, it's places that possess you. And the reason why I like it and where I could potentially see a bridge into this children's project and community project is thinking about how children and maybe artists generally often anthropomorphize or personify things around them. They form characters out of things that aren't necessarily characters. For example, the chair is a person, or the cup is a friend. You know, the idea of like building people to talk with and then also play with and converse with. I think that's maybe like traditionally a child's trait, which is when you build imaginary friends. But I feel like as an artist, I do that all the time, but I do that with materials, and I do that with things and places. Like I have an ongoing relationship with glass. I feel like I know glass as I know a person. So maybe the link is something to do with that, how when you become familiar enough with a place, that place almost becomes like a body or a person that you can interact with. And if you can interact with a body, then you can also experiment and play games with a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, that children can engage on terms that adults sometimes, because we think a lot more concretely, us who are not artists in the way that you are. And children have got a very high degree of abstract thinking capability, generally speaking. So I understand what you mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think your project itself is a play. I'm sure the children thought this work is just a part of a play rather than making an art piece. It's not about sitting on a chair and then drawing on a paper, but I can see that you're using all 6 senses on this project, like something like listening to the sound and expressing it, listening on the street and local noises and sounds, or something like lying on the paper and drawing on the paper, or protege. All those sorts of things are being a part of the play with the children. And I think that's why you get lots of different.
That's only part of the answer. Really, we need a 3-arrowed approach. 1 arrow where we have to get bullseye on is the whole supply side, boosting investment, innovation, infrastructure spending, and getting the incentives right, particularly for small firms. A second arrow is the fiscal policy.
What was that?
Someone's news.
That was random.
I thought it was a really, really pressing question.
Different perspective.
Yeah. Well, you were saying something really interesting, Gina.
It was the sound. Gina, you're talking about the sounds and,
Yes,
the
sound.
senses.
Yes, senses. And I think that's why the drawings, the maps became more diverse. As you can see, some people are drawing from the bird's eye view, some people are drawing from what they can see. So it's all different, and you're making 3D to 2D, and then you're making into a 3D again.
Yeah.
So from that process, there's lots of space changing and the perspective changing into it.
Yeah, there's a lot of different universes being constructed and collapsed, and I like how it's kind of like a language. There's like a language or scripture of developing between the panels, how sometimes there's overlaps and sometimes there's differences. I like how it's language building.
And on that thinking on the sound sense, the hearing sense, you said something in your presentation along the lines of how adults found it, or do often find it difficult to translate sounds into pictures, or more along those lines. Do you find that children find it easier? And if yes or no, whichever way, what sort of images were they making?
So I couldn't include so many, but there's a wall there that has from floor to ceiling examples of their responses to drawing sounds. And some of them are like fantastical, and some of them are like kind of like a line like you would see on a heart monitor. And if it's a very loud siren sound, for example, from an ambulance, it would be like really, really strong and like jagged and sharp. And if it was maybe the park, it would be sort of a lulling. If I go quite far back here, you'll see this is kind of a it's not a lexicon, it's kind of a it's a what is it called when you have a little table which shows you how to read things? So
legend.
Yeah, so it's that. So a cat makes that sound, a shower is that, a bird chirping is that, water running is that sound. So they kind of build this language in a way in which then they use throughout the drawings, which is quite interesting.
As you're explaining that, I'm just thinking of Egyptian hieroglyphs. A cat is this sound, or a cat is this picture, and this means this word.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
It is a language in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's kind of like how language began, is sounds. So
all future Kandinskis here.
Nice.
Aren't they? Abstract drawings.
But on a practical sense, I think the feedback I got is some of them obviously very confused and took them a couple times to get into it, but then a lot of them really embraced the fact there are no rules to go back to play again, being like, it took them a while to get over the fact that they didn't have to like perfectly draw something, because that's what they're taught art has to be. It has to be perfect. It has to be the best thing I can make.
Yeah.
Like the sound drawing exercise is all about, it doesn't have to be perfect, and once that's learned, that's an amazing thing to learn, I feel. Which
leads on to the logical extension question about how the teaching staff coped with that idea. And this is not having a go at teaching staff at all, because there is a curriculum to follow. That idea of it doesn't have to look like this. It can be what it needs to be. What was their general feeling?
It's interesting because, like, as a contemporary artist, I'm interested in as I've said, the expanded field. I've said that I don't know how many times. And anything I do in my own personal work, I have to contribute to forming new knowledge around the medium, or attempt to do. That's what I'm attempting to do. And I think the way art education works and what art is continually evolving. And I think it takes a long time for things to get to a place where we don't just have this strictly traditional form of what art is. But if you say the word art, or you look at a sign towards an art gallery, it's normally like a picture of a boat or something on a sign, or things like that. It's like how iconographies of art filter through society and how we're taught art should be. And a lot of that comes from a place of not knowing, and guess having the opportunity to learn about those things is what helps those ideas progress. What do you think? How do you think art can develop more in specifically primary education?
I haven't seen an awful lot of it. I mean, I work in a school myself. I don't usually work around the art times, which disappoints me, because I'd love to be able to see the art lessons. Every so often I am around the art lessons. And I think, yeah, children do get a certain amount of free rein to kind of interpret things in their own way, shall we say. But if you give a child a stick of chalk, say, or a bunch of coloured chalks out on the playground, it's a whole different art world, because children are suddenly not as constrained by the four walls, or it feels like it to me. And I'm always fascinated by what children produce in their play, as opposed to what they are producing when any given adult obliges them to produce something. Because qualitatively, it feels very different to me. So, I don't know, maybe that's because us adults, in whatever role we take in children's lives, are necessarily imposing in that environment. Unless the children see us as fellow players, and I'm treading on very careful ground here, because of course we're not fellow players, we are adults. But sometimes children do choose us as, to use your word earlier on, collaborators in the play space, the art space, because art is play. Play is not a frivolous thing. Play is a very highfalutin thing, very deep. So I'm fully on board with the idea that art is play. And it can lead to some amazing thinking processes.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting because it leads to the challenges of how you facilitate, or how you push yourself to learn to facilitate the best you can, to encourage maximum engagement and enjoyment in those that participate in what you're facilitating, particularly when if it's a child learner or a child artist. And that only just makes me want to just make more workshops to continue that process of better understanding and providing better and better things, I guess.
Yeah, you use that. Did you use the word fully engaged there? I'm just picking up on that. Did you say that phrase? I can't remember. Maybe I
something along those lines.
It sort of sparked in my brain just then. We heard of flow state. The idea of flow, where you're kind of basically so deeply into something that you can almost, simplistically speaking, forget everything else that's going on around you. I see it all the time in children's play, in the classroom, but we do it as well. And if you're fully immersed in something, and art is a prime example of this. If you're fully immersed in art, nothing else matters, because that is the most important thing in the world at that time for that person. So yeah, I'm broadly with you.
Nice.
In that respect, more than broadly with you, shall we say.
The Catherine asks whether this kind of project will be continued in Wandsworth.
Yes, I believe so. As I said, it's the opening project announce this sort of ongoing collaboration. I think a project on this scale every year would be very demanding on everyone involved, but it definitely wants to continue. And I'd be interested to see, I mean, I'm not directly involved in the new iterations or in that planning stage. Perhaps I will be when one day. I'd love to come back and do something again in Wandsworth, because I live in Wandsworth. So I'm also a part of the community. Yeah, I believe it's going to continue.
It will be great. And I think not only within the Wandsworth, but if it can be a set module and other councils can run a project like this, it'll be great.
Yeah, it would be amazing. I could license it and pay my rent.
Yay!
To go back. No. But you could also argue that anyone that's participated carries the work and the project. So think how many people have engaged, and actually how many kids have actually made the artwork, that hopefully it might be a core memory or something that leads them to pursue a creative career or life.
Right. Because after looking at your work, to be honest, I was comparing with my childhood with my daughters. When I was little, it was very safe. I mean, I lived in New Zealand, so it was pretty much rural, but we could walk to school without our parents, but nothing would happen, you know. So we used to wander around, we used to make our own way to our school, but nowadays it's not like that. We always be with our parents, and, you know, fast. We just look forward and walk. It's quite different. And but so I thought, oh, maybe it might be a different generation. But looking at your work, the children are receiving the new word in a kind of their own ways, and it's not that straightforward as I thought. And I think that was very interesting for me to see how the children are receiving the world as different as me, but finding that as their own ways. And it was lovely to see lots of green trees as well. I mean,
they are so smart and so intelligent. They are so clued up about the environment. They, like, most of them know more than I do about the environment, which was great to hear. So I'm like, in particular, their appreciation for the environment, it was at such a high level that I'm feeling comforted by that generation's coming up with those beliefs.
Brilliant.
Do you think we should does anybody want to do a sound exercise, or I mean,
your hands up if you want to do an exercise.
I can't. Can you see anyone? I can't see anyone.
Should we go for it? How long do you think it will take?
I can do it short. Let's just do 2 or 3.
Let's go for it.
How do I get out of this? Can you see the chat box on my screen?
No.
Okay, cool. Sorry. Okay, so has everyone that's wanting to do this got a piece of paper and some pencils, coloring pencils, anything really, felt tip pens, anything you can grab?
Remain. Not fully prepared yet.
Okay, so is everyone prepared?
Yes.
I believe. Yeah. Okay, great. So we're going to be doing sensory drawing, listening to the community, where I'm sure you've heard about a million times now. You're going to be asked to draw a series of things, and you'll have 2 minutes to draw each thing. And then I'll set a timer, and at the end of the 2 minutes, you'll have to stop and prepare yourself for the next drawing. You'll be asked to draw the sounds of things, but you cannot draw, or try your hardest to not draw visually what that thing may look like in real life. What's interesting is the slippage that occurs and how that's often very hard to do. So there's some prompts here on the screen for you as I read them out. These are just for you to refer back to if you're struggling or if you need any extra help. So some of the prompts are: what do people do differently in those spaces? What actions occur? Do different sounds have different colors? What is the texture of sound? Are the sounds you hear loud or soft? And does sound have shape? So these could be some ways that you can help develop your drawing. Okay, so has everyone got a pencil handy? I'll get my timer up.
Do we draw it all in one paper, or?
If you've got multiple pieces of paper, then you could do a whole side of A4, or if you want to be safe, maybe you could like put a grid on your paper. If you can spare the paper, I'd use a whole sheet of A4 because it's much more fun. Okay, so the first one is I'd like you to draw the sound of the playground. Okay, so the sound of the playground. And your time starts now. Thirty seconds remaining. And that's time. Pencils down. Okay, so if you're getting another piece of paper, get that ready. If not, turn your piece of paper over maybe. So the next one is, please can you draw the sound of the high street? The sound of the high street. And time starts now. 30 seconds remaining. And that's time. Okay, so we're just going to do one more, the last one. So get prepared. So the last one's going to be, can you draw me the sound of the park? The sound of the park. And time starts now. Thirty seconds. Time. Pencils down. Okay, brilliant. So I'm just going to take you through what I did originally when I gave myself these, and I also gave these to another artist, Victoria Doyle, who worked with me on the creative exercises, testing them out and things like that. And it's interesting to see the differences between us. So the sound of the playground, this is the one I created first. I guess I'm quite a rigid person, and I found it very hard to begin with this activity. So I initially went for like actual sound waves. And so I began to think about clusters of kids within the playground, how there could be individual kids or kids in pairs or kids in large groups. So perhaps the cluster below the playground title could be a group of kids playing football or something like that. And then I found the big green splodge on the top right is the teacher sort of observing quietly, or as this mass in the space. For me, not very successful drawing, but it was the first time trying it, so I kind of panicked and I just went for what I think sound looks like, which is waves. This is Victoria's version of the playground. When I saw this, I was like, wow, that's incredible. So I think she focused on one particular child moving through a playground, kind of swooshing and moving. So how movement really influences her visualization of sound. The sound of the high street. This is what I created. So again, I kind of take this quite topographical approach where rather than observing one sound, I'm trying to encompass the entire sensation of that environment. So on my high street, I have a train track that goes over across on a bridge. And so that's just the purple sounds are like the da-dun, da-dun, da-dun of the carriages moving. And then the brown blocks are just the sound of buses going up and down the road. And then you see these pink circles with the little blue circles underneath. That's the sound of someone speaking on the phone or the someone listening to music. And then the little circles underneath are just the sound of the shoes on the pavement. And then those repetitive sort of irritating red dots are the sound of a crossing that like comes at you quite urgently. It's frustrating. It frustrated me how mapping the sounds on the drawing did sort of visually represent how High Street looks like. So again, it was challenging for me. This is Victoria's version of the High Street, which seems, like very condensed, very layered. There's a lot of sounds going on here, but it seems to emerge as this kind of almost like a cake, this layering of sounds for her. Here's my sound of the park. Again, I'm taking a bird's eye view rather than looking at one sound or picking one favorite sound from an environment. I guess that's my sense of how I experience environments as a total and find it hard to break down environments. Or maybe I have an awareness that seeks to encompass the entire environment to get a full experience. I'm not sure. So here you can see the center has these blue kind of rippling, almost like mouth shapes. And that for me doesn't represent a pond, but it represents the sound water makes when it goes from a higher pond to a lower pond, down like the trickle of water, that kind of like funnel sound. And then around it, you have blue and green parallel lines. And for me, that's the sound of trees aching or groaning as they move with wind through their leaves. And then you have some more little brown dots, and that's again is shoes, people walking. And then the red straight lines of dogs barking. So again, I'm using red as something urgent. It's very hard to divorce red from urgency. And then naturally, I want to apply blue to something that's liquid and something that's fluid. So again, maybe I'm getting tricked by the visual as the way I depict sound. This is Victoria's The Sound of the Park, which is a beautiful drawing that could do very well in a central London gallery. But this kind of swooshing sound, and I think she was focusing on grass, the movement of grass with her passing over it. So you've seen mine. Would anybody like to share one of their drawings or
to share?
Pardon?
Does anyone want to share?
Yeah, would anybody like to?
I can share mine.
Which one would you like to share?
Guess
wow.
What this one is?
Which one's that?
This is the playground.
The playground. That should I
I'm
stop?
an artist, but at the same time, I'm a mapper as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the whole space. And when you're inside the playground, every single one is running around, or at least moving. So all my lines are tracing the children's movement. And while they're moving, they're making sounds. So I'm trying to trace their movement and the sound with the drawing lines.
Nice. Could you hold it closer to your camera?
Yes. So some are...
Were the colours representing anything for you?
The colours, not every single one is representing the specific thing, but it's more cheerful and live and diverse sounds that you get from the playground. Whereas I've got this kind of drawing for High Street.
Wow, okay, yeah.
Because High Street, once again, as a mapper, when I see the space, it's consisted with one big line, the street where the High Street is, and then it's divided into two. And High Street, when you have a chat or, with someone else, it's always a short talk. You don't have a long conversation on the street. So I'm trying to use the short and fast lines where they make short conversations, where the cars and motorbikes go really fast. So it's more of a fast drawing. And with the park,
Wow.
So when you're in a park, you get more airy, don't you? So you're kind of nowhere, doesn't have a where to go or where to locate yourself, but you're in the middle of nowhere in the park. But all you hear is, I don't know, I was trying to make some calm park, the quiet park where you can stand by yourself and hear the birds and the dogs barking.
Interesting. It's like, yeah, there's quite a big spatial expansion on yours, and it actually kind of feels void-like or tunnel-like. Actually, that the drawing of the park for me it's kind of a bit foreboding. I don't feel particularly safe within that drawing of a park, you know, and maybe that's to do with the colors that you've used and the way it's been drawn. But I certainly get a sense of expanded space. Would anybody else? Thank you for sharing those. They're really interesting. Anybody else like to share theirs?
Catherine, do you want to go? Did you do
Do mind if you know?
Who'd like to go? You go.
Should I go?
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Right. I'll show you two of my three because my second one I'm not happy with at all. I've done it in pencil, so I don't know if it will come up. I'm not even sure you can see this.
Wow.
See it?
Yeah.
This is playground to me.
Wow.
I don't know how successful I was in just a short time, but I wanted to get some sort of 3D-ness about it. That basically, children on the playground is just these little bubbles, and now I kind of create an image out of it. But you're right; it's a tricky exercise for us adults, isn't it? But to me, no matter what the play is, it's a bubble of play, and I've been using that metaphor for longer than I care to know anyway. So that for me was the natural image of playground. And park was also an interesting exercise myself as well, because I kind of did park without thinking about it. But it turned into the direct opposite of what I'd written about parks before. Okay, so again, I don't know if you can see this, but it's kind of like a almost a kind of like a strange version of this style, I suppose, in a very pared down way. I started just with a blank rectangle. I thought, because to me, when you go in a park, quite often for me, I've gone to London parks, or I've been to park in Manhattan. What's it called again? Central Park.
Yeah.
We went into Central Park, which was a mad experience. Dipped my toe in there, literally about 20 feet, and it's absolutely quiet. You come off of whichever road we were on. For me, it's the same in London parks, which was representative of the main rectangle. And then I'm thinking, well, no, there were pockets of other things going on. But what I looked at for 30 seconds at the end of this was, in my studied, researched experience, the middles of parks tend to be kind of dead zones, really, because in terms of children's play, because it's kind of very, very visible, and all the action kind of happens in the kind of the third area, not the actual extremities, because that's also a difficult zone, kind of like the Goldilocks zone, which I've not represented here at all. But maybe it's a good way I didn't do that, because I've made those sort of sketches before, and this is something completely new and completely subconscious for me. So yeah, I'm very freaked out by what I've drawn there and why I've drawn that.
No, I love how minimal yours are compared to ours, and also the first one, it looks like the cosmos or dust, or some kind of gravelly material. I love that, but it's so minimal. It kind of reminds me of come on, don't fail me now, brain.
For me, it's more like Mark Rothko. The drawing version of Mark Rothko.
Oh, I've got her book right there. Pencil drawing artist who does extreme realism of like seas and stones.
I know the sort of art.
Cecilia?
Pardon?
Cecilia? No?
I've got to find the book. It's right here. Vida Clemens.
Oh, Vida Clemens, yes. The first drawing.
Yeah, the first drawing.
Yes.
your approach, yeah, I'm not going to get the book out, but I've said the name now. Yeah, like her very, very delicate, very sensitive approach. But it's interesting, yeah, and so different, but similar language with the park one, just like tiles.
But I'm coming from admittedly quite a biased perspective in my career, in that I am almost constantly thinking what spaces are like for children rather than for adults. And so I suppose that comes through in the drawing. If I was thinking for how spaces are used in terms of adults, I think my drawings would be very different.
But again,
you don't want to share your drawing. No.
Okay, bro.
Okay. Should we? Is there anything that you want to talk about more?
I'll just do one thing, and then I'm sure everyone's dying to get away. If you're interested in this type of working, try looking at Howard Hodgkin or Vivian Suter, two really amazing abstract expressionist, inspired but a lot more interesting artists that work in a kind of an automatic way with drawing and painting. And then thank you very much. If you wish to contact me, there are my details. Thank you very much. Nice speaking with you all.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah.
I really appreciate you all for attending today, and hope you had a lovely time as much as I did. Yeah, so if you have any more questions, you can directly email to Alexander or to us, Livingmaps Network. Thank you, Joel. You too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Joel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye.